Politics, getting into politics was a trickier one for me, I suppose. I mean, I was born in 1970, so it's when my kids call back in the black and white days with all the photographs. But we lived in the Lower Falls Road, quite close to the city centre. We lived in a terraced house. We had 2 rooms upstairs, 2 rooms downstairs, an outside toilet, no bathroom, and everything that was going on back in those days. But and this is where the Dutch comes in as well. I suppose my mum worked for a Dutch charity, and they used to take children from some of the hardest hit areas of Northern Ireland across to Holland at various times of the year. So my sister and I, we were Irish twins, by the way. So there's 11 months between us, and my wee brother came a few years later. So we would have spent a lot of time growing up in Holland while my mum was working, and we would have been fostered or staying with Dutch families at the time doing that. So that's where the Dutch comes in. So at that time, for my early years, we were bilingual children living on the Falls Road during those days. So we always knew we were a wee bit different, but you'd always your friends and got on with it, and it was always grand. But we left Belfast near the end of the 70s, and we moved to a housing estate in Antrim town. And it was a mixed housing estate, so there were Catholics and Protestants living together, and it wasn't any big deal for us as kids. We were all friends and played together, and we had a Catholic primary school and a Protestant primary school in the estate, and we both went to our separate schools and came out and played together. So again, just that sense that there was a wee bit of difference, but nobody really cared, and we were all friends and got along, and it was all okay. But 1981 was the year that my sister and I were transferring to secondary school, and Lagan College was opening. My mum was told about Lagan College, Northern Ireland's first ever planned integrated school, and she made the decision then that that's where we were going to be going, because we were in the same year at school. My sister would have been the eldest in the year, and I would have been the youngest. She's a July birthday, and I'm a June one. So it was, again, yeah, that was a tricky one too. But Lagan College came along. We went to the integrated education, and there was huge amount of media attention and focus on that school. I remember our first day at the school. There were so much media at the front of the school. We didn't have a school, by the way. It was in a scout hut. The school was just trying to get itself up and established at the time, but we had protesters. I think it was over in Shaw's Bridge at the time, so most of Castlereagh Council were protesting that this school would be on their land. And we went to a Catholic primary school, and in P7 then you go through your confirmation, and that's a big ceremony in the Catholic church. So it was a big mass, and when the parish found out that there was 2 children going to an integrated school, they helicoptered the bishop in to come and take that mass, and he stood in the pulpit and he told everybody that there were Catholic schools, there were Protestant schools, and Catholic and Protestant children should never be educated together. And so it was like a bit of a public shaming, I suppose, for my mum and my family, although I was just more interested in my new dress that I was wearing and what everybody else was wearing. I wasn't really paying too much attention, to be honest. But that was the context of my sort of early years, I suppose, and the media attention that came with Lagan College. There was people coming from all over the world, a lot of cameras, a lot of questions, a lot of, people wanting to know what it was like to go to school with Catholics and Protestants. But I was already living with Catholics and Protestants. My friend circle at home was just like that. So that wasn't really it wasn't a big thing for me at the time. But looking back on it, I suppose it was really, really formative. And what going to Lagan really allowed me, rather than understanding the other, as we like to call it, it showed me this city, Belfast City, in a way that I don't think I would have ever have got to see and understand if I had went to my local comprehensive in Antrim. Because when you're at school, you hang about with your friends, and that's your bubble that you run about in.
Yeah.
And our classmates came from everywhere. They came from Antrim, Lisburn, Craigavon, Hollywood, and all areas of Belfast. It was a real spread that we came from. So we all moved about, and that's where we went, and that's where we stayed in everybody's houses and went to, hanging out together. And we all met in Belfast city centre and ran about in those teenage years. So I would say that was really my formative years. But at the same time, politics at the time to me was a bit. Have you ever watched Snoopy? and Charlie Brown on the TV. And when Charlie Brown's in the classroom, the teachers stand at the front of the class, and you never see the teacher and you never hear the teacher, but it's just this constant wah, 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 wah. And to me, that's what politics was like. It was sepia tone. It was a lot of men talking, a lot of conflict. News was horrendous. It was about bombings, shootings, and you know, in my early, I just had to block it out. It was the only way that I could cope with it anyway. So that's what politics was to me. But I was also living, my mom was a real community activist. And although she did those holidays and that cross community work, when we moved to Antrim, she also ran our local community centre. And that was where the youth clubs happened, the discos happened, and that was the hub of our community as well. So, and that was also the house that I grew up in. So there was always a lot of media or a lot of journalists or photographers or people passing through our house. You know, the local community police would have stopped in for a cup of tea and those conversations would have happened. So there was, you know, nobody ever had a key to our house. The front doors, back doors opened and people just passed through. So I had that sort of grassroots community sense embedded in me as well. But it wasn't really until, I suppose, the Good Friday Agreement and peace agreements were being talked about that I started paying attention. I'd lived in London for a few years and wasn't long back to Belfast. And when we were moving into that sense of something else might happen here, that change might happen, that's when I really started paying attention. We had things like the Women's Coalition coming and women demanding a seat at the table, that their voices needed to be heard. I started looking at that gender divide as well. Why were women not there? What did women need to bring to the table? What was our experiences? And, you know, a lot of connections started happening around then, but that sense of hope that was there was really, really palpable. And I was having to make decisions, you know, as I was going to be having my first child. I was going to be becoming a mother. What was I going to do with these future wee people? And what did I have to offer them? What did Northern Ireland have to offer them? Was I going to stay here? So all this was going on in my life. And I'd left school with no qualifications. I absolutely loved school, don't get me wrong. I wouldn't have missed a day. That's where my friends were. That's where the crack was. But I was not an academic in any way, shape, or form. And once I left school, I went on the YTP scheme, which is a youth training programs. I did various jobs, in and out of jobs, because there were jobs back then, I suppose, as well. I went to London for a while. But I worked as a chambermaid actually in London in one of my first, so coming from a 2 up, 2 down in the Falls Road to a housing estate in Antrim, and then moved to London. And my first address was the Grosvenor House Hotel, Park Lane, London. And I was a live-in chambermaid, you know. But I'd seen this other world that was out there. I seen what wealth was. I seen what choices and options that other people had in lives. You know, I really had my eyes opened, and then coming back here with this sense of hope and optimism and becoming a mother. And I started paying attention and decided that it was time to get myself back into education to do something different. And when my children then were, I went on to have my own Irish twins, by the way. It's a bit of a family trait, I suppose. But there's 14 months then between my son and my daughter. And they were in primary school, and when they were settled, I went back and went into education, tried a few A levels and different things, but never really stuck with them. And it wasn't until I did an access course in women's studies, and it was a 2-year part-time course, and it was designed then to get you to university entrant level. But that's not really what I was focused on when I was doing it. It was a very clever course in just bringing you along step by step by step. So when I finished those 2 years, then I had an offer from Queen's University to go and study there as well. And I was the first person in my family who'd ever went to university. So it was a bit exciting too. So I did my politics at Queen's, and I started to look at political parties and what was happening here, began to understand the institutions, how they operated, what was going on. And it was there that I discovered that the Green Party were an actual real party, you know, and they were here in Northern Ireland, and that was good too. But started looking into them and what they were all about, and I think I probably voted for them in the past, along with the Munster Raven Looney Party, I suppose. You know, all, you know, anybody but the usuals and the traditionals. But yeah, I suppose that's when I started looking at the Green Party, looking at that being a real political option, a real tangible one. And it was a huge decision, actually, just trying to join a political party. I was still very, very nervous, and I'll never forget that whole experience of making that decision within myself that I was going to join a political party. And I think in Northern Ireland that can be still really tricky and hard for people. It's like nailing your colours to the mast, I suppose, being so public and open about it. But I did. I made that decision. And it was one of my tutors, John Barry, at Queen's University, and he was teaching one of the modules. And I remember him asking a question specifically to the class, of asking people who wanted to work in politics, and nobody put their hand up. And then he asked the question, well, why are you studying politics? So that really got me, yeah, why are we here? You know, so I suppose that's the real short synopsis of how I got into the Greens. And where I come from, but I also felt that, you know, looking into the Greens, looking at who they were, what they stood for, there's this global connection, but there's the real local context, and there's founding principles within that. And I felt that I could sign up to those founding principles. And this party and those local activists in the party at the time, I felt that I could be myself. And I come from a very feminist agenda, very feminist politics, and I felt that I could still bring that to the party, that wouldn't be silenced, and that I could learn from the party and the party could learn from me. So it was very much not just two-way, but multi-way involvement in terms of being a member. And I still hold true to that today. So I just love that energy and ability with the structures of the party that I chose. So that's the short version of how I ended up joining the Green Party and sitting here today, I suppose.
Yeah, so when you say about we have choice now and education is interlinked in that, talking to like climate activists in the past and the organisation Extinction Rebellion, there's always a drive for change. And I guess the question in everyone's mind is, what is Northern Ireland's strategy plan to help tackle climate change?
What is Northern Ireland's strategy?
Yeah.
Help tackle climate change. That's a funny one. Well, we don't have a strategy. That's the very short answer. Now, more recently, what we see are most parties talking and acknowledging that we have a climate emergency. But we do need the strategies to come behind that. And I don't feel that we are there yet. But we do have, and what I will put out as an upbeat one is that we have the UK Climate Act, and that applies to us in Northern Ireland. But it's not particularly focused on our own local environment and our own local circumstance. And that's where we need to start coming up. We need our 5-party power sharing executive to start coming up with the strategies to deal with this. So declaring an emergency, acknowledging that climate is an issue, acknowledging that we have to do work is all good, but its implementation really needs to be stepped up. So when we look, even in the context, Brexit has brought this to the fore even more. So while we have the protocol in Northern Ireland, that's, you know, and I will hold firm that we need that protocol, because what it brings is the very minimum, and not even in all areas, but the very minimum basic environmental standards in some areas. And there's those limited protections that we still hold on to that GB don't have because they're not within the protocol. But what we do have during the whole negotiation process of Brexit, what we had was Scotland, England and Wales all sitting at the table having negotiations at various levels, while Northern Ireland didn't have an executive. So our institution had collapsed. So I was first elected in 2016, and by January 2017, the executive had collapsed. But these were the formative years of sitting at the table, working out what you need to do. Various ministers from various regions working with the EU as well to come up with plans. So the UK government basically transposed a lot of the EU regulations. This is the environment regulations. You know, we've never really had charge of this on our own. We've had it at a European level. So here we are leaving the European Union. So the UK government transposed a lot of those regulations into domestic laws just over those periods. But what you see at the same time is the Scottish Assembly them working towards their own strategies, their own primary legislations. Wales doing exactly the same. While they were signed up to the UK overall strategies and legislation, they were working towards their own primary legislation for their own context, while Northern Ireland had nobody. We had no ministers there, and that was a huge problem. So when the Assembly was re-established last January 2020, I'm forgetting my years here, We were already on a back foot. Brexit was happening. We were in the transition phase, but yet we have no specific legislation being worked on for ourselves. And we are, I would say, a bit of an environmental wasteland here in Northern Ireland in so many ways. So we would have the UK government then putting out the Environment Bill, for example. Now, while it covers much of the UK, it is very England-centric, because we already know Scotland and Wales are working on their own prime legislation. So we in Northern Ireland are going to be held under not just the UK Climate Act, but also the Environment Bill. But it's not specific to our context. So our ammonia levels, for example, and our intensification of the agri sector are not the same in Scotland, England, and Wales. So we need our own strategies, we need our own legislation. And the same applies with the agricultural bill. So agriculture would have been dominated by EU policy and managed really at an EU level. And here we are in this time now, this context where we're going to manage this for ourselves, but yet we have no agriculture bill in Northern Ireland. So they're just two, I suppose, small things. Not small, they're not huge, sorry, but they're two individual pieces that we could be working on. But we're dealing with Brexit, and we're dealing with fallout, and we're dealing with building political trust to maintain and sustain this 5-party power sharing executive. So there's a lot to do in a very short space of time. But what is good, I suppose, looking at the chinks of light in there, is that most parties are starting to talk about the climate emergency. We have brought a motion to the Assembly, which was overwhelmingly supported by a majority, to support that we have a climate emergency, that we need to act on that. And within the New Decade New Approach deal that we established the Assembly back last January, there was the commitment then to come forward with a Climate Act and an independent environment agency, and it's that independence that's absolutely critical, because we don't have any of that here either. So we're trying to move forward on those, but yet we're not seeing much coming from the minister in terms of delivering on that. So there was a motion brought last June to the floor where we called for the minister to bring forward a Climate Act within 100 days, and the minister then basically dismissed us as ridiculous, that it was a ridiculous time frame and that it was impossible to deliver. So I just rubbed my chin at the time going, really? Is it? Is that really?
Yeah, because climate change is an emergency, it's a health emergency. So to say you can't do that in 100 days is kind of saying, like, is the public well-being not important?
And these 100%. And if it's an emergency, how long do you allow an emergency to develop before you take action? And if we're beginning to understand that climate needs to be front and center of all policy for sustainable futures, then we need radical, we need rapid, and we need urgent action. So I put a call out to the wider civic sector asking, do we think that that's impossible? Conversations generated, and within 100 days, what happened was not just the skeletal bones of what a climate act could look like, but was a fully fledged climate bill was drafted and put forward, and it was put forward with political support. So we have all parties in the Assembly, apart from the DUP and the TUV at the minute, who have signed up to this bill, which is unheard of in itself, and it's coming as a private members bill, and my name is as the lead sponsor. But we have Sinn Féin, SDLP, UUP, Alliance Party, we've People Before Profit, ourselves in the Greens, and Claire Sugden and Trevor Lunn as independents, all signed up to this bill already. So we're working that through the system at the minute. It is with the Speaker's Office. We are trying to engage with the Northern Ireland Office and the Secretary of State for consent mechanisms, and hopefully we will be able to bring this forward very, very rapidly. But in turn, what you've seen was when that move happened was that the DAERA minister then launched a consultation on a climate bill. So despite telling us that it was impossible and ridiculous when we started working on our own and doing it in spite of him, then we started seeing a wee bit of movement as well. So it'd be good to see if we get to a stage where we maybe have 2 climate bills to be debating.
Yeah. So we now have a poll so the poll is when selecting a party or politician to vote for, is the climate emergency your top priority? So for people watching, you have a yes or no answer.
Am I allowed to interfere in that one? Do a bit of lobbying?
Go ahead.
Well, people, we can't think of climate or the environment as something over here and politics happens here. and that's where we need to start changing hearts and minds. That's where politics needs to start shifting.
Yeah, because but with climate change is not just a separate issue. It's interlinked with everything that we do, especially the health of the public and health of us.
Absolutely.
Like to present day, climate change kills over 2 million people each year. So for a government and a country to be like, no, we're not doing a climate emergency, it's kind of ridiculous. And the public of NI is so demanding, and please keep on being more demanding because we need change. And like speaking with like young people who are like in their early 20s or like teens or whatever, climate change is like one of their top priorities, and they want change, and we need a government to support us and support that.
Yeah, and when I'm speaking to groups as well, and you know what we get with the Green Party is a lot of the time we would get challenged or dismissed as being a single issue party, but I don't see that at all, because climate, biodiversity, and the world that we live in impacts on every aspect of your daily living. So I would challenge then in terms of, what do you think politics is? Politics is about making decisions in the public interest. And if we are not making decisions in the best interest of people, then what are we making decisions on? And that question needs to be answered, you know, and it is, so while it is a global issue to be dealt with, and it is a global emergency, you act at the local level. So for me, environmental issues are the school that you go to, the house that you're living in, the food that you're eating, the air that you're breathing, the transport systems that you have. All these things are climate, are emergency, are green. So if we're not looking after that in the best interests of what we can deliver, then what is it that we're doing as politicians and governments? And that needs to be challenged. So it starts with local, it starts with your own environment. To me, that is your environment. And if we're not looking after your environment, then we need to be called out.
Yeah. Speaking on the health aspect of it, so 1 in 10 people suffer from eco-anxiety. So for people who don't know, eco-anxiety is the fear that one experiences when they think about the world going to end, etc. And so what is the government's plan to help with the public well-being?
Again, it goes back to the other one. What's the plan? I argue that there is no plan. But in terms of the eco-anxiety, this upsets me as well. And I've seen it, and I've spoken to a lot of people who have that. But anxiety is, you know, is this sense that everything's too overwhelming and can't be dealt with, that it's just too big. And if there's anything that I could say to maybe try and address or reduce that in anybody, it's break it down into small chunks. We can't do everything all at once. We just can't. It's impossible, which is why you need it happening at all levels. But break it down into the smaller, more manageable, but also tangible change that has happened, because I do believe it is happening. So, for example, we have declared we're now having the majority of politics and political parties acknowledging that there's a climate emergency, wanting to do things about that. But I would also say that very rarely do politicians lead. More often they follow. And I will say that there's been many, many years now, I've been around knocking doors, we're looking for votes, or we're engaging with the public, we're having those conversations. And again, oh, the Green Party, yeah, it's all about the environment, yeah, that's grand, but how you're relevant to our politics here. The last election that happened, I was knocking out doors, all our team were out there, and for the very first time ever, when people were opening the door, we were saying with the Green Party, they were going, and they were engaging us in the conversations. And it was because their children were talking to them about climate, about the environment, about plastic pollution. You look at the work that David Attenborough has done, and the profile and the media coverage that's gotten. So hearts and minds are being won. And when voters are telling you that this is what we want to see focused on, then politicians and politics will start responding, because their votes are at stake. So never forget the power of yourself in that one. And I genuinely will stand by that. Happened during the last 1 or 2 election periods. So that momentum is there. And then you think about the local wins that we do have as well. So, you know, you're asking me, is there strategies and what are we doing? I think that there's all that grassroots level. Please break it down. Don't be anxious about it. Start thinking about the wins. Look at the Extinction Rebellion. Look at the youth strikes, our Fridays for Our Futures. Look at all these different movements that are happening. They are changing the conversation, and that just makes me go, great. But what we also have, and this is the NI specific part, I suppose, is Northern Ireland still in the very early days of creating a political, not say class, but institutions, learning what it is to deliver, to manage, and to uphold these systems. We go from, crisis to crisis to crisis to, how many times the Stormont collapsed, for example, since it was established, so many times, and we're just back up after another year. So we have a model of governance that we need to start having a look is it fit for the future? Is it fit for purpose even? It's a model not like anybody else's. We have, this mandatory power sharing executive, and this is all the legacy of our past, of our sectarian divisions, of our divided society. In order to include everybody, we have this model where we now have 5 parties sitting in an executive, and to get anything through the executive, those 5 parties have to agree. When's that ever going to happen?
Yeah.
And what has come forward from the executive in terms of delivery. So there's many layers to that, but there's loads that you can do if you break it down, and I do believe that it is happening.
Yeah, like climate change is such a big topic, and it can be so overwhelming, but there's so much to the climate change topic, like plastic pollution, people's health, mental health, fast fashion. So as an individual, it's like, I don't know what words to use, but as an individual, I think it's important for everyone to take and educate themselves on it as an individual, and empower your voice. And once you educate yourself on an issue, you start to understand why it is a concern and an issue. And then once you have that knowledge, then you can use your voice to speak up. And that's exactly what Extinction Rebellion has done. There's so many amazing organizations, and like you said, they're changing the conversation, and we need to keep pushing that conversation and demand change, like demand what is right for people.
Yeah, and make it manageable as well. It's not about, when you make it conflict, that here's what's happening and you need to, so people would resist that type of challenge an awful lot. So it's just about the general relationships. It's about those general conversations. And exactly as you say, Caoimhe, see, when you come across an issue, and if you start to educate yourself on it, have those conversations, because that's what's happening in houses. And it goes back to that thing that when we were knocking doors, people were saying, yeah, because their children are talking about this. And I would imagine then that within their schools, they're talking about the plastic pollution, they're talking about the whole big problem, and they're, educating kids in, single-use plastics and reusable, reduce, reuse, and all those messages. And they're bringing that home. And they're bringing that home to their wider families, and their families are engaging in the conversations. They're starting to recycle more. You see reusable things being brought into schools, and kids really engaging with that. So that's just one example of how that change is happening. So rather than the standoff or the fight, which does need to happen as well, but just not everywhere, but when you have the knowledge on a subject, pass it on. Don't keep it to yourself, because we all need to know it. And it's a powerful tool.
Yeah, so education is such an important factor when talking about an issue. You cannot talk about an issue if you don't know the facts. So within the school curriculum, I don't believe there is climate change in at the moment. So should climate change be interlinked with the school curriculum?
I would like to see that happen, but I would like to see that happen along with politics. I mean, politics isn't even in the school curriculum either. So yes, I would like to see that. I think that it should be happening not just in a classroom, but in so many avenues. Why, we could put this in our art galleries, we could be putting this in our museums, we could be putting this in our community outlets and structures, and even the street art that we have, for example, but we could be using so many channels to get that out. And when we look at our creative sector, they're phenomenal, and they do so much. It's about engaging at all levels. But yes, I would like to see it in the curriculum, but for the main reason that we need to move forward based on science and fact over the myths and the misunderstandings. So if we can have a science-based education program, I would fully support that 100%, because we have a huge body of work to do to overcome and dispel a lot of the myths and the naysayers out there. And we just, have to say Trump, and the fake news that goes on and the denial that goes on. But yeah, fact-based, science-based decision making can only come when people are educated with facts and reality.
Yeah, and then the nature of the subject of climate change, it can be overwhelming, and you would never want to like load down on an individual and make them feel so like anxious about it. You would want to educate in a more healthier way. So maybe it's not about like throwing climate change at school children. Maybe it's about like breaking it down in the sections such as like plastic pollution, educating them on single-use plastics. What even is plastic? Plastic is a material we've only been using since World War II, which isn't that long ago, realistically.
Yeah.
So it's like we can live without this again. And then such as like how does climate change affect human well-being, mental and physical health? So it's all about these like factors and breaking them down, because once you take a step by step, it's not so overwhelming, but you're getting your results.
Yeah, and this whole issue about plastic, it is just seen as such a solution. It's an easy commodity, but really what it is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And whether that be in food packaging or in disposable items in households, straws and all sorts, these are temporary situations that we're using a permanent entity for, so it's getting those balances right. We can do it differently, of course we can, and it is very, very recent that we've created that, but doing it with confidence, absolutely, rather than berating, because it's these problems, that's the other element, we're not created by young people, so we cannot hammer them in terms of being responsible for it either. This society that we have has been created and implemented by my generation and those above me as well, so yeah, we have a responsibility here to redress the wrongs that we've embedded as culturally acceptable.
Yeah, when you were talking there about the science as well, there's some scientific evidence that some of the environment has been damaged since the 1980s, and that's obviously before I was born, and probably most people here were born. So it's kind of like we're being educated on something we're being educated on something that weren't even alive to experience. So it's kind of like, in a sense, we're picking up the pieces that people before can arguably, the damage that they cause, people can argue that it's like we're being left to tidy up your mess.
Yeah.
And with COVID, it sprung a new wave of plastic with using disposable masks, plastic gloves. The word disposable makes people, it comes across as easy, like use this, you can throw away, it's so easy, you don't have to wash it. But like when you throw that into the landscape, the average person won't even think about the journey that plastic is going to take, and you don't think about where it's going to end up. It could end up in the ocean, kill an animal. So it's kind of like, what do we do? Because there's signs everywhere it says like, oh, wear your mask, but should we not promote reusable masks?
Well, I would always use reusables. Most of mine have been made at home by my daughter as well. But of course, and it's this disposable culture. But again, I'll not use the pandemic as the issue to beat people again. We're in extraordinary times, and people need to stay safe during that, and that needs to be the front focus without a doubt. But we can manage it much easier, much better, and much more environmentally sustainable, of course. But then you bring in the whole medical thing. We're not talking about banning plastic. Plastic is a phenomenal material, and has its use, but not in the disposable culture. Because again, it's this thing. It is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And it's those types of messages, and I think that when you frame it in ways where people engage, just okay, get it, it's not recyclable, it's not reusable, so therefore don't make it a permanent material. So it's those things. But I know that what you're saying about the COVID crisis, and I'm a wee bit conflicted on this one, so come at me if you need to, but I would be a wee bit wary again about using the pandemic as the issue. I would rather be looking at what we can be doing to address the ongoing issues, when you're even saying back in the 80s that, that this was all happening, we can see evidentially that this has been growing and growing, and you weren't alive then, so this is not your problem. But I was alive in the 80s and I was a teenager, and I could have said the same, but in terms of the conflict that we had, this wasn't me that did this, but I'm dealing with the legacy of that. So every generation that comes along, there's always the problems that you're inheriting, I suppose, and it comes into that element of guardianship, maybe. But I'll link it in coming from the political angle again. So back when we were doing the peace deals, when we come up with the Good Friday Agreement, we were setting up these institutions, and that whole sense of hope that was galvanized then. For me, it was about this hope that a new future or different possibilities were there, that the expansion was going to happen. And I want to get into that. I was becoming a mother. My kids are in their early 20s now. And so there's a whole generation in Northern Ireland who have an experience that I haven't got. And I see it as my responsibility, I suppose, to start creating the space for you guys to come and take over. For me, that's what this peace deal was all about. It was about creating different channels, taking violence off the streets, moving it into a political arena. Now you've got this whole experience. The world has shifted in terms of your generational development, globally as well as locally. Where's the space for you guys to come and be those decision makers? And that's what we really need to be looking at. And if the least that I can do from the very privileged place that I sit now is to just push my elbows open a wee bit and allow you guys to come and take over. For me, that was the sense of hope that I had. And it is about making sure that those spaces as public decision makers are open to you guys, because it's your experience and your future that need to be setting the agenda for all decisions that are made in public bodies, not just in politics, by the way, in every element. So we're talking about your school boards, the board of governors, sit there. If you want climate to be taught as a subject, if you want environmental education, make sure that you're on those board of governors and they're having that conversation, that they're making those decisions, and that they start implementing and delivering what you feel is important for the future. And it's all those levels, if that makes sense and isn't too much, but you need the space, and we need to create the space to allow you to come and take it over, because I'm only keeping your seat warm.
Yeah. Exactly. Like I said earlier, like I think education is like the root that needs to go down, and if we could interlink climate change into different, like breaking it down into the school curriculum, you also doesn't always have to just be in the school curriculum. It's like how can general people get educated on climate change? And there's so many like online group chats, there's so many organizations that want to educate you on these issues and help you extend your knowledge on it, so you can have those conversations then with other people. And it's all about community and just engaging with everyone. So yeah,
get involved. That's the real key, isn't it? And go back, so when I was at school, I left school with no qualifications. I was not academic, so when I think about that education, yes, it is of course really, really important, but you're not going to get everybody involved at all stages. And I'm not knocking education by any stretch of the imagination here, but it has to happen on multi levels, and it has to happen within communities. But what we're really getting to there is the cultural change that's needed, and that doesn't just come from formal education, that comes from all levels. But again, I'll go back to that hope. So the youth movement, the Extinction Rebellion, but even within our business sectors, even all sectors are now talking about our environment, about sustainability, about just transitions, about a climate emergency, biodiversity emergencies. But what's slow to follow is the political leadership at that level, in terms of forming, making, and coming up with the strategies. We don't have a problem with that in Northern Ireland. We have strategies for everything, but we don't implement them, and we don't resource them, and we usually shelve them and move on to the next crisis. And that's the fault line about in terms of delivery. So cultural change comes from all these multi-layers and levels in which we live our lives. And I don't think that there's been a better time in the history of humanity in terms of being able to engage with information. And whether that be through social media channels or other ways, access is out there. So I think the most powerful thing that we can be doing is encouraging people to get involved at whatever level works for them. And every level is important. in every level is absolutely needed. So no matter where you're standing, come on in, please.
And I
Create
think
your space.
I think it's important as well to like create like a healthy space and educate yourself on an issue like this.
Yeah.
Like, don't read it all the time if it does make you feel overwhelmed or anxious. Read a wee bit every day. If you don't like reading, join a group. And like there's so many like different forms of communication and educating yourself.
Yeah.
There's also like different videos, documentaries, say for Edinburgh, bunch of Netflix you can watch. So there's always like a whatever works best for you, there's always a way for you.
But I would say don't get anxious, because
Yeah.
anxiety can be debilitating. Get angry, because anger is a motivator for demand and change. I got into politics because I was angry. I was angry that I wasn't being included, that what I was listening at a political level was not relating to my life, to my experiences. You know, I've gone through, you know, as a single parent, struggling to live on benefits, to try and bring up my kids, to look at what future am I giving these people. I was homeless, living in a hostel on the Orma Road, and you know, so housing, all these issues. I was bloody angry. Do you know what I mean? And that anger has just propelled me to say, well, nobody's doing it for me. I have to get involved myself. I chose a political route at that level. But you know, get yourself in there, swap anxiety for anger, and make anger your motivator for demanding better, because this is your future. This is your children. This is your housing, your health, your education, your food, the air that you're breathing. And we don't even have a clean air strategy, by the way, in Northern Ireland, but we'll not go to. But make anger your motivator for getting involved, demanding better. It's not going to be done for you, but you can certainly influence those who are making these decisions, and demand your space at the table wherever you're sitting.
Anger is our new motivator.
Good.
Someone just wrote into the group chat, in what ways can museums play a bigger role in building awareness to climate crisis?
Keep talking about it. I think it's just that simple. Keep the conversations going, and you know, break it down into those achievable. So there's the big stuff, and we've got COP26 coming up at the end of this year, and that's going to be hosted in Glasgow. So the UK government are hosting COP. Can't be a better opportunity, you know. Get motivated, you know, get organized, get involved with Extinction Rebellion, get involved with the youth strikes, get involved with whatever local community activism is going on. It doesn't have to be the big stuff, but as long as it's your stuff, and as long as it's where you are, then that's all good. So that's the most immediate thing you can do, is get involved, keep the conversations going, and base it on fact, you know, and let's bust the myths. And I think it's achievable, but it's a huge work. And I don't believe that there is a real understanding, certainly not within the political decision-making level, of how radical and how deep we need to make these changes, and how far that's going to impact on how we are right now. We cannot keep doing what we're doing, and in a very short space of time, in a decade or less, it has to be radically different, and we need the bravery of people to be able to do that. So empower is the word, I suppose. You know, don't maybe berate, you know, politicians. You know, I think about our executive ministers, they're human beings as well, you know, so make them feel okay to create the changes that we need to see them doing. Make it okay for them to do that, rather than maybe fighting them, because they are in this wilderness just as much as the rest of us are.
Yeah, and like you cannot create change if you continue to live the way you are. So we need new strategies, we need new habits, we need new everything. A lot of people are asking about how art relates to, or how museums relate to climate change, which is right down my street. So as a museum itself, it's all about community, and it's an educational space. So if there is an exhibition on about climate change, or RRR did back in August, Kick the Dust, which is all about climate change and how it relates to heritage and museums. So museums as a whole is a community space, it's educational, and if there is an exhibition on about climate change, you feel like you're in a safe space, because museums are scientifically proven to have reduced anxiety levels. So you feel safe, you feel comfort, but you are still educating yourself. And on a personal level, as a photographer and an artist, I've started educating myself on sustainable practice instead of taking the easy route. So instead of using just paper, I use sustainable paper, recycled paper. So it's all about educating yourself and your practice as an artist. a current project of mine is called the Plastic Emergency, and it's all about the plastic crisis. You literally can't go anywhere these days without seeing plastic everywhere, and it makes me really angry. It's just disgusting. So I'm using my platform and to educate people on sustainability and the plastic pollution crisis.
And the other thing with the museums, they're people's spaces. Let's not forget that most of our museums, we are, quite fortunate, are still free to go into. So the public spaces, and it's not just linked to, when we say museums, I mean all public spaces. It goes back to the concept of libraries, sharing resources, and keeping ownership of public spaces. So go in, but what you can do in those spaces is tell the story. And you can't tell it safely. I remember being really shocked going into the Ulster Museum one time, and they were telling the story of the conflict that Northern Ireland has come through, and there was a photograph of me at school, and I go, I'm in the museum, and I'm there with my children, But it's about this development. So and again, you go back, even when you mentioned, the 80s, you can see there's progress from back then. You weren't alive then, but keep those stories being told. And what those public spaces do when they're public bodies is, let's keep it focused on fact. Let's keep focused on science, and let's use those public spaces to share the resource that we do have and make sure that everybody has access to them, because accessibility is absolutely key. And that's where museums and galleries and those creative sectors really come into their own in terms of the power to engage. When we can keep them free, they're public spaces, let's make sure that we protect that element. Let's fund them properly, let's allow them to do their work, and make sure that we as society provide the channels for engagement, because there are spaces. Let's own them, and tell the stories that we need to be told.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when it comes down to everyone that lives in Northern Ireland, like, we live in such a privileged part of the world, and we have all these resources to help educate ourselves in these the climate, anything related to climate change, while, like, there's people who wake up every morning and they're dying of climate change. So I think we need to realize how privileged we are and use those resources. And yeah.
But and when we look at it's the most vulnerable people and societies and communities who will be worst affected by climate change. And I always use the analogy. I remember I seen it in a study somewhere, but they were trying to sort of measure. So we look at United States of America. If everybody in the world were to live the same lifestyle as the average person, I know disparities and poverty levels come into play, but if on average, if we were all to live like an average American, it would take 5 planet Earths to sustain us. But yet, if we were all to live the same lifestyle as, say, a smaller community in sub-Saharan Africa, it would take half a planet Earth to sustain everybody. So us in the Western world, in European context, to live the lifestyles that we live takes 3 planet Earths to sustain us, and we don't have that natural resource. So therefore, it's about that redressing that global imbalance in the haves and the have-nots. And when we are in the privileged position, we do have to take responsibility and acknowledge that we cannot maintain and sustain the lifestyles that we live, and therefore we're going to have to give back a little bit. But that's to save lives elsewhere, because we're not immune. In Northern Ireland, we will suffer climate change as well. And we just have to look at the flooding maps, for example. We're already seeing, the weather patterns change a lot. We're suffering floods, for example, and we don't have the infrastructure to deal with that. This is another legacy of, not providing public services properly. But what we do have is the overdevelopment. So I live in South Belfast, for example. So up around Carryduff direction is a big commuter town. It's a big expansion. They keep building private developments, a lot of housing. There's no infrastructure around that. And our water systems, our sewage and infrastructure underground cannot deal with that level of development. But yet we still keep passing planning permission that we know the infrastructure can't deal with. And that causes problems. And that causes flooding, and that causes lack of access to public resource and public services. So it's about, that's it done at the local level. So while we continue to want to build what we have, we don't even have the capacity to maintain it ourselves. So it's not always the big picture. You know, you can break that down to a local level and how unsustainable our current system is.
Yeah, it really is currently unsustainable. Although I feel like the young people who are making the choices, they want sustainable. They want a more greener future.
Yeah.
And I think if everyone listens to those ones making the choices, and then the government allowed space for them, we will achieve a more sustainable future.
Yeah. And we just even have to look at how we're operating at the minute, so that, you know, policies coming out of the executive, and even just look in terms of food and food production. And we have this deliberate strategy of intensifying our agricultural sector, for example, and you can see this over the past 10 years. So this is when we would have heard a lot about Northern Ireland PLC, and we're opening up to the rest of the world. We want to do this trade. In order to do that, what we had to do was deliberately intensify an unsustainable level of production, which has cost us environmentally. So there's a population in Northern Ireland of 1.8 million people, and we produce enough food to feed 10 million. And that's for export markets. So we're selling that to the rest of the world. So we have this really bizarre situation where we're producing lamb, for example, and we're selling it to New Zealand, who are famous for their production of lamb, and sell it to us. And it's about these global trading blocks. You know, these are unsustainable models. But what we get in terms of, if we want to get stuck in and start unraveling this, then we get accused that we're not, you know, we're knocking the economy. This is jobs and people's livelihoods at risk and whatever. But I say that's a completely false narrative, because what we as an executive and an assembly and elected politicians need to do is to put in place the economic benefits to live sustainably. You know, it's not every farmer is producing this. It's not every farmer wants to be one of these mega pig farms where they lock the pigs in cages and have thousands and thousands of them. Do you know, we have about 34 million chickens in Northern Ireland, by the way, and 1.8 million people, but you know, but put economic benefits for farmers to create a sustainable agricultural sector, to have nature-friendly farming where we value biodiversity as much as we do the lamb chop that's going to America. You know, having that sense of wholeness rather than focused on just this one channel. And I think that those are the conversations we urgently need to have. But I don't think that we'll see change if we don't engage our citizens. You can't leave it to just a small group of people to do this. It's just about creating civic assemblies, for example, about smaller community conversations. And if we break that down and start talking to people at local levels, I would say that what everybody really wants is security and health, housing, education, and resource. How do we deliver that? I think it can be quite straightforward, but let's bust the myths. Let's not, you know, hold it as a them and us. It's, you know, by redressing all this does not put anybody at economic risk, but faulty political decision making and faulty economic strategies that incentivize overproduction for unsustainable models. That's the problem. And economics and economy systems are built by people. So let's change those.
Exactly. So I think it's time now for the audience questions. Stefan, if you want to come back on.
Hey, yeah, brilliant. Thanks. Thank you two so much. Yeah, we've got a short amount of time for any questions from the floor. I think you'd actually already read one or two out that were museum related. There is one other that's in currently from Fidelma. It's about, let's see, we were disappointed that gold mining was not mentioned in the proposed draft of the climate change bill. The toxic pollution of gold mining would affect our water, air, land, and health. The Canadian company Dalradian also plans to remove 166,000 cubic meters of peatland, which is well known as carbon store. Would you like to comment? That's from Fidelma O'Kane of Save Our Sperrins.
Hiya, Fidelma. Good to know you're there. Yes, 100%. You know, and the peatlands. So we're talking, what we're hearing at a political decision level is, you know, the acknowledgement that peatlands are, you know, need restored and that there's work going on there, but we're not dealing with the mining, of course. You know, so it's this continual system of silo. And I think, was that relating to the climate bill or the draft climate bill? Was that mentioned?
Not mentioned in the proposed draft climate change bill.
Yeah, And the draft bill is more about, we can't take every issue and legislate for it. It's going to be really quite impossible. But what we can do is set the framework to demand that departments and executive start to come up with the strategies and start delivering on them. And absolutely, mining will be there, including the gold mining, but also all the rest, with the intensification of farming. We've got our anaerobic digester problem, we've got the ammonia problem, we've got no air quality strategy, we've got so much, and it is, and if we want to reduce the anxiety and make it into manageable bite-sized pieces, then what the draft climate bill that we have submitted has done is legislating for delivery timelines. So there will hopefully, it's what I would call an enabling piece of legislation. So we will be calling on the executive that if this bill is passed, that there is a time frame, 3-year period, where they come forward with their overall strategy of what we will be delivering and targeting. Then mandated within that is each department separately will have their 1-year plan, and they must deliver on their 1-year plan. So it's broken down. So then we go into DAERA, then we go into infrastructure, then we go into education, then we go into health, justice, all these different departments. They are going to be accountable on an annual basis, and the assembly will then vote through on their delivery, but that will be monitored and overseen by an independent environment office and a commissioner. So we're hoping that when we put the framework in place, that everything will be encompassed. And it's very much like other models that have been adopted elsewhere as well, that we're just starting to see big benefits from. So it's rather than just targeting one area or one specific issue like the gold mining, and I'm not diminishing what you're going through, Fidelma, I know exactly what's happening up there, but we're trying to deal with it in a structural framework, so therefore nothing gets missed, but accountability is absolutely prevalent and measured. I hope that helps a bit.
I think Emma asked a question.
Yeah, she had one in just before that, because I know Mary was saying she had to go. Mary McGuigan asked if there was any conversation on a citizens' assembly going on.
That's the key to so much, is the citizens' assemblies. For a lot of the reasons Keith and I were talking about there, that's where the education, the engagement comes in. That's where we can start to see at a local level what are concerns, where are the myths, where we can start to build, the consensus for new ways of being. So I would be wholeheartedly be supporting that we can only do this when we have citizens' assemblies, when we have that level of engagement, and people don't feel that this is something being done to them, but give them the agency, because collectively we all have to move forward to make the changes that's desperately and urgently needed, and that can't be done to, but has to be done with and from people, without a doubt.
Just as you said about engaging and education, that leads on to Emma's question: how do you use your voice when restrictions are in place? Do you have any suggestions on campaign groups to follow? So that kind of like ties in with what we were talking about earlier about Extinction Rebellion.
Yeah.
They're like split into like multiple groups. So you've got like an art group, a media group. I'm not too sure of the other groups they have. And then is it Fridays for the Future? Mm-hmm. Yes, and can't remember names of other ones, but there's so many.
Yeah, Anna Kernahan, and there's a few really, really great people in there. And they're phenomenal in terms of not just their actions, but where they're coming from, what they know, and where they're going as well. They just I've spoken to a few of them, and just you will be so impressed. I find them phenomenal. But there's loads of online spaces. I suppose that now we're, stay home, stay safe messages there, and it's going to be here for another wee while. By the way, don't be listening to Boris's bluster. We might get a bit of a summer ease again, but this is a winter virus, and we don't know what next winter's going to bring. So this is again another impact of the climate emergency that we're living through, is that we will see more pandemics coming as well. So we have to learn to be confident and engaging with these new channels and these new ways of being. So please do find what's happening in your social media spaces, in your local communities, in other places as well. But we're all going to be developing these new channels, so get engaged. But if you can't find one, then start one. Let it be what you think you can do from wherever it is that you're operating from, I suppose, at whatever level. We need it everywhere. So if it's not there, create it and tell us about it, by the way, make sure that we all know it's out there. I think just that social media changes everything, doesn't it? It just it allows for such engagement that was never there before.
It's such an educational tool, especially during these restrictions. You can literally find anything on social media and you can use it to your own benefit. So if finding climate change on it, you can.
But I just have to learn how to do that in the house without sitting on the same seat all day, looking at the same screen. So maybe going to need a bigger screen in the house that's just turned on and chatting to me as I'm moving about, But yeah, so we're all still learning, but it's here to stay. And I can't see, even when the pandemic's over and we're all managing it really, really well, we have learned so much about how we network, communicate, and engage in these new forums. Who knew about Zoom this time last year? Who knew about the power of Teams as an online resource and tool? We've learned these new communication channels, and they're definitely not going away. They're fabulous.
Yeah, I think another tip for getting involved with the whole climate thing is, if you know someone who's highly involved in climate change, it could be a climate activist, or ask them to have a Zoom call with you, have coffee, just talk about climate change.
Yep, just ping. That's all you have to do now. Ping.
And then who knows? Because I spoke to loads of climate activists a few months ago, and it led me to get into group chats with Extinction Rebellion. So you never know where conversation may lead you.
Yeah, and they'll be glad to hear from you, because that means that their message is getting out there. So that's good.
Exactly. It's all about community and extending that community.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant, both of you. Thank you so much, Claire. Really, you've been very generous with your time.
Absolute pleasure. Delighted to have been asked, and thank you.
I think we've no more questions. I was going to ask what Sammy Wilson's really like, but I'll leave it for another day. Caoimhe, thank you so much. Some great questions and great debate going there too. And I think the thing we're coming away with is just it's a lot and it's scary and it's imposing, but actually nothing changes if we live in fear. We can take action, small, local, and help be part of that change. So I'm feeling after these 3 talks motivated.
Great.
But thank you so much. When you made your Charlie Brown reference about the teacher, I was sitting there going I've had this sort of sat here for
very good.
Yes, ma'am. But thank you both so much. We'll be releasing this recording in a couple of weeks. Hopefully we're going to get ISL, BSL and subtitles over, and we'll be releasing the other talks with John Barry and Niamh McNally as well. But for now, just thank you so much, both of you. And thank you all who joined in, took part, watched, asked questions. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time.
Thank you.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.
See you later.